him advice, would you tell him to
stop? That's what I would tell him. Stop.
Hammer fist. 50 seconds. That's it. It is all over. Cain Velasquez.
And wait a minute, you mean to tell me that I can put some money down and I can see Babalu and Tito, both the guys that got knocked out twice by Chuck Liddell, fight each other? That's fucking entertaining.
To the fight. Tito's right. That one hurt many seconds. 15 seconds. Jim Buckley out of Tito trying to survive to get to the third round. It is all over. Rashad Evans.
The transition from WWE superstar to UFC fighter isn't just about learning new skills. It's about discovering that choreographed violence and real violence exist in completely different universes. These are the stories of 5 WWE legends who stepped into the octagon and found out the hard way that professional wrestling success means absolutely nothing when someone is trying to legitimately hurt you. So sit back, pop a white monster, and enjoy.
He's a very nice guy and he's a hard worker, but he does not have athletic talent. He's missing a lot, and he's a showman. And when he was in the WWE, he was allowed to say, "I am the fucking man," and throw his arms up in the air. Right. And they had it scripted so that he was the man.
And right now, this isn't CM Punk talking to Triple H. This is Phil Brooks talking to Paul Levesque.
I lost, and it sucks, and it was lopsided.
Phil Brooks was 36 years old when he signed with the UFC in December 2014. He'd been out of the wrestling ring for months, burned out from his WWE run, and looking for something that would reignite his competitive fire. The UFC saw a good finance opportunity. Brooks saw validation. Neither got what they expected. The man who had main evented WrestleMania, who had held the WWE Championship for 434 days, was about to learn that none of that mattered inside a real fight. Training at Rufusport in Milwaukee, Brooks threw himself into mixed martial arts with the same obsessive dedication that had made him a wrestling superstar. He trained with former UFC champions, worked on his striking, his grappling, his conditioning. But there's a difference between learning techniques in practice and applying them when someone is genuinely trying to hurt you. Brooks was discovering that difference every single day in the gym. Mickey Gall wasn't supposed to be a world beater. He was 2-0 as a professional, selected specifically because he seemed like a reasonable first opponent for someone making their MMA debut at nearly 40 years old. But Gall was a real fighter who'd been competing in combat sports since he was a teenager. Brooks was a performer who'd spent decades perfecting the art of fake fighting. The skill gap wasn't just noticeable, it was embarrassing. When the fight started, Brooks came out aggressive, throwing wild punches that looked more like something from a wrestling match than a legitimate mixed martial arts bout. Gall stayed calm, waited for his opening, and took Brooks down with ease. Once the fight hit the ground, it was over. Brooks had no idea how to defend himself from a competent grappler. Gall sunk in a rear naked choke and Brooks tapped out, his UFC debut ending in complete humiliation. But that wasn't the end of Brooks' suffering in the UFC. Dana White, despite the disastrous debut, gave him another chance. The second fight came against Mike Jackson at UFC 225 in June 2018. Jackson wasn't a world-class fighter either, but he was still infinitely more experienced in actual combat than Brooks. This time, instead of a quick submission loss, Brooks endured 3 full rounds of getting systematically beaten up. Jackson didn't try to finish the fight quickly. He seemed content to drag Brooks through 15 minutes of punishment, landing shots at will, taking him down whenever he wanted, and generally making it clear that Brooks had no business sharing a cage with even low-level professional fighters. The decision was unanimous in Jackson's favor, and Brooks' UFC career was mercifully ended with a record of 0-2. The real tragedy wasn't just the losses, it was watching someone who had been so confident, so successful in his previous career, look completely lost and overwhelmed. Brooks went from being one of the most respected performers in sports entertainment to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing your own hype. His UFC run became a joke, a meme, a reminder that real fighting and fake fighting are completely different skills. Brock Lesnar's story is more complicated because, unlike Brooks, Lesnar actually found success in the UFC, but that success came with a price that nearly destroyed his body and left him questioning everything about combat sports. The Beast incarnate didn't just suffer losses in the octagon, he suffered through a medical nightmare that would have ended most fighters' careers permanently. After dominating college wrestling and finding fame in the WWE, Lesnar shocked the world by signing with the UFC in 2008. His athletic credentials were legitimate, his physical tools were undeniable, but transitioning Switching from sports entertainment to mixed martial arts at the highest level is like jumping from a swimming pool into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The scale and intensity are incomprehensible until you're drowning. Lesnar's first fight against Frank Mir exposed his inexperience in brutal fashion. Despite overwhelming Mir physically, Lesnar made a crucial mistake that allowed the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt to secure a knee bar submission. The tap came at 1 minute and 30 seconds of the first round, and suddenly the former WWE champion was staring at his first professional MMA loss. But Lesnar bounced back, using his incredible wrestling base and freakish athleticism to capture the UFC Heavyweight Championship by defeating Randy Couture. He successfully defended the title against Frank Mir in their rematch, seemingly proving that his first loss had been a learning experience rather than a sign of things to come. Then came the fight that changed everything. Cain Velasquez didn't just defeat Brock Lesnar, he systematically destroyed him. From the opening bell, Velasquez pressured Lesnar with crisp boxing combinations and relentless pace. Lesnar, who had always relied on his size and strength advantages, looked lost against an opponent who matched his intensity while possessing superior technique. The beating was so thorough that it seemed to break something inside Lesnar psychologically. The knockout came in the first round, but the real damage was deeper than just the physical punishment. Lesnar admitted afterward that he didn't like getting hit, a confession that should have been career-ending for any mixed martial artist. In a sport where absorbing damage is inevitable, admitting you don't enjoy that aspect is like a race car driver saying they're afraid of speed. Then came the health crisis that nearly killed him. Diverticulitis, a condition affecting the large intestine, struck Lesnar with devastating force. The pain was so severe that he couldn't train properly, couldn't eat normally, couldn't function as an elite athlete. Multiple surgeries followed, each one carrying the risk of ending his fighting career permanently. When Lesnar finally returned to face Alistair Overeem at UFC 141, he wasn't the same fighter who had dominated the heavyweight division. The illness had robbed him of his conditioning, his confidence, and his desire to continue absorbing punishment from world-class heavyweights. Overeem finished him with a brutal liver kick in the first round, and Lesnar announced his retirement immediately afterward. The man who had seemed invincible in the WWE, who had conquered NCAA wrestling and briefly ruled the UFC heavyweight division, walked away from mixed martial arts a broken fighter. His body had betrayed him, his mind had turned against the violence, and his legendary toughness had been exposed as insufficient for the demands of elite-level combat sports.
I beat Chuck Liddell. I smashed Chuck Liddell. I put my fist through his face. He was face down, ass up, and it wasn't my girlfriend.
Chuck continues on Tito. Combinations, uppercuts, Chuck is on the head.
I mean, Tito's lost every fight he's had over the last 3 years or something, right? He won one fight in the last 3 years against Bader.
Tito Ortiz entered the UFC octagon in 1997, carrying himself with the swagger of a man who believed his own hype. The Huntington Beach bad boy had dominated amateur wrestling in college and possessed the kind of natural athleticism that made coaches salivate. But unlike the previous wrestlers who had transitioned from sports entertainment, Ortiz came to mixed martial arts directly from collegiate competition with no WWE background to cloud his judgment about what real fighting actually required. His early UFC career seemed to validate his confidence. Ortiz steamrolled through opponents with his relentless ground and pound attack, using his superior wrestling to control fights and his heavy hands to punish anyone foolish enough to stay underneath him. He captured the light heavyweight championship by defeating Wanderlei Silva and successfully defended it multiple times, establishing himself as one of the most dominant champions in UFC history. But success in mixed martial arts is temporary, and Ortiz's reign came to a crashing halt when he faced Chuck Liddell at UFC 47. The Iceman had been hunting Ortiz for years, and their personal rivalry had reached a boiling point that made the fight feel more like a blood feud than a professional competition. When the cage door closed, Ortiz discovered that his wrestling dominance meant nothing against an opponent who could keep the fight standing and possessed knockout power in both hands. Liddell's sprawl defense neutralized Ortiz's takedown attempts, forcing the champion to stand and trade with one of the most dangerous strikers in the sport. The knockout came in the second round, a devastating right hand that sent Ortiz crashing to the canvas and ended his championship reign in spectacular fashion. But the real suffering was just beginning. The rematch at UFC 66 was even worse. Ortiz came in desperate to reclaim his title, but desperation doesn't overcome skill gaps. Liddell picked him apart for 3 rounds, landing clean shots at will while making Ortiz look like an amateur who had wandered into the wrong building. The decision was unanimous, and Ortiz's status as an elite light heavyweight was officially over. What followed was a painful decline that stretched across years of increasingly desperate attempts to recapture his former glory. Ortiz's body began breaking down from years of intense training and accumulated damage. His back problems became so severe that he required multiple surgeries, each one promising relief that never fully materialized. The man who had once seemed indestructible was now struggling to get through training camps without significant pain. His performances inside the octagon reflected his physical deterioration. Former training partners began outclassing him. Younger fighters exposed his declining reflexes and diminished conditioning. The crowd favorite, who had once packed arenas with his charismatic personality, was now generating sympathy rather than excitement. Each fight became another reminder that Father Time remains undefeated in combat sports. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Ortiz had built his entire identity around being the baddest man on the planet, and watching that image crumble in real time was crushing. He began making excuses for his losses, blaming everything from bad judging to personal problems to inadequate training camps. The confident champion had been replaced by a bitter veteran who couldn't accept that his time at the top had passed. His final UFC fights were difficult to watch. Against Lyoto Machida, Ortiz was systematically outclassed by a fighter who made him look slow and predictable. The Brazilian picked him apart with precise counter-striking while avoiding any significant damage in return. It was a masterclass in technical superiority, overwhelming faded athleticism. The end came not with a dramatic knockout or submission, but with the quiet realization that Ortiz no longer belonged at the highest level of mixed martial arts. His release from the UFC wasn't controversial or shocking. It was inevitable, the natural conclusion to a career that had peaked years earlier, but refused to end gracefully. Ken Shamrock's suffering in the UFC was different from the others because he had actually helped build the organization from its earliest days. The world's most dangerous man was a legitimate pioneer who had proven himself in real fights long before mixed martial arts became mainstream. But his return to the octagon after years in professional wrestling created a tragedy that was painful to witness. Shamrock's early UFC career had been legendary. He was one of the few fighters who understood that mixed martial arts required mastery of multiple disciplines, and his combination of catch wrestling and submission skills made him nearly unstoppable in the mid-1990s. His rivalry with Royce Gracie helped establish the credibility of the early events, and his victories over legitimate fighters proved that size and strength could overcome technique when properly applied. But professional wrestling had changed him. Years of performing predetermined outcomes had dulled his killer instinct and replaced legitimate fighting skills with entertainment value. When he returned to the UFC in 2005 at age 42, he was facing opponents who had been training mixed martial arts their entire careers, while he had been learning how to take bumps and cut promos. The comeback began promisingly enough with a victory over Kimo Leopoldo, but that win was more about nostalgia than current ability. Both fighters were past their prime, and the victory said more about Kimo's decline than Shamrock's resurgence. The real test came when he stepped in against current elite-level competition. Tito Ortiz demolished him at UFC 61 in a fight that wasn't competitive from the opening bell. Shamrock looked slow, predictable, and completely overwhelmed by an opponent who was in his athletic prime. The technical knockout came in the first round, but the damage to Shamrock's reputation was irreversible. The man who had once been considered the most dangerous fighter in the world looked like an aging athlete who had stayed too long at the party. The rematch was somehow even worse. Ortiz needed less than 2 minutes to finish Shamrock again, this time with ground and pound that forced the referee to step in and save the veteran from further punishment. Watching a legend get systematically beaten by a fighter he could have handled in his prime was heartbreaking for longtime fans who remembered when Shamrock was genuinely feared. His final UFC appearance came against Rich Franklin, another fight that ended in the first round with Shamrock absorbing significant punishment before the referee mercifully stopped the contest. 3 comeback fights, 3 first-round losses, and a legacy that had been permanently tarnished by the decision to return when his body and skills were no longer capable of competing at the highest level. The most tragic aspect of Shamrock's UFC suffering wasn't just the losses themselves, but what they represented. Here was a man who had helped legitimize mixed martial arts when it was still considered a freak show, only to return years later and become a cautionary tale about the dangers of fighting past your prime. His contributions to the sport's early development were overshadowed by images of him being overwhelmed by younger, hungrier fighters who had surpassed his skill level. Dan Severn's story represents perhaps the most complex case of suffering in the UFC, because his pain came not from dramatic losses or physical destruction, but from the slow realization that the sport had evolved beyond his ability to adapt. The Beast from the East had been one of the most dominant fighters in early mixed martial arts, using his incredible wrestling pedigree and ground control to suffocate opponents into submission or decision victories. Severn's early UFC dominance was built on a simple but effective formula. Take opponents down using his world-class wrestling credentials, control control them on the ground with his superior strength and technique, then either submit them or grind out decision victories through positional control. His record in the early tournaments was impressive, capturing the UFC 5 tournament and establishing himself as one of the most feared grapplers in the sport. But mixed martial arts was evolving rapidly, and Severn's game was becoming obsolete with each passing year. Fighters were developing better takedown defense, learning how to work effectively from their backs, and most importantly, they were becoming more well-rounded in their skill sets. The days when pure wrestling could dominate elite competition were coming to an end, and Severn was too set in his ways to adapt. His later UFC appearances became exercises in frustration as younger fighters neutralized his wrestling and exposed his limited striking ability. The man who had once controlled the pace and location of fights found himself being outworked by opponents who understood that modern mixed martial arts required constant evolution. His grinding style, which had been revolutionary in the early days, now looked predictable and one-dimensional. The most painful aspect of Severn's decline wasn't any single devastating loss, but rather the gradual recognition that his approach to fighting had become antiquated. He continued competing into his 40s, accumulating losses against fighters who would have been easy opponents during his prime. Each defeat reinforced the reality that his window of elite-level competition had closed permanently. His final UFC run was marked by lackluster performances that seemed to drain the energy from arenas rather than exciting crowds. The dynamic grappler who had once made wrestling look like an art form was now struggling to implement basic takedowns against fighters half his age. The sport had moved beyond him, and unlike some veterans who could reinvent themselves, Severn's rigid approach to competition made adaptation impossible. The tragedy of Dan Severn's UFC suffering was that it happened so gradually that many fans didn't notice until it was too late. There was no dramatic knockout that ended his relevance, no single moment where everything changed. Instead, it was a slow fade from elite competitor to nostalgic reminder of what mixed martial arts used to look like before the sport became truly evolved. What makes these stories particularly devastating is that each of these fighters had legitimate reasons to believe they could succeed in mixed martial arts. Brooks had been a successful amateur wrestler before his entertainment career. Lesnar possessed freakish athleticism and legitimate wrestling credentials. Ortiz had actually succeeded before his decline began. Shamrock had been a pioneer who helped build the sport. Severn had dominated during the early era when technique mattered more than athleticism. But the UFC has a way of exposing every weakness, every limitation, every false belief about your own abilities. The octagon doesn't care about your previous accomplishments, your reputation, or how tough you think you are. It only cares about what you can do right now, in this moment, against someone who is genuinely trying to hurt you. The physical suffering these fighters endured was obvious and documented. Brooks getting choked unconscious, Lesnar absorbing brutal punishment from Velasquez and Overeem, Ortiz being knocked out by Liddell, Shamrock getting stopped repeatedly by younger opponents, Severn watching his game become irrelevant. But the psychological damage was probably worse than any physical beating they received inside the octagon. Each of these men had to confront the reality that their self-image was built on foundations that couldn't withstand the pressure of legitimate combat competition. The confidence that had carried them through previous careers crumbled when faced with opponents who possessed superior skills and genuine fighting experience. The mental adjustments required to accept that level of humbling are more difficult than recovering from any physical injury. Their stories serve as reminders that professional wrestling and mixed martial arts exist in completely different universes, despite sharing some superficial similarities. The athleticism, the showmanship, the larger-than-life personalities mean nothing when someone is trying to legitimately hurt you inside a locked cage. The skills that make someone successful in sports entertainment can actually be counterproductive in real fighting situations. The UFC's unforgiving nature doesn't allow for the kind of character development and storytelling that defines professional wrestling. There are no predetermined outcomes, no safety nets, no opportunities to recover from mistakes through creative booking. Every moment inside the octagon is real, every punch carries genuine consequences, and every mistake can end your night in spectacular fashion. These 5 stories paint a brutal picture of what happens when the worlds of sports entertainment and legitimate combat collide. Each fighter brought something different to their UFC journey, whether it was Brooks' delusional confidence, Lesnar's freakish athleticism, Ortiz's championship pedigree, Shamrock's pioneering legacy, or Severn's technical wrestling mastery. But the octagon doesn't care about your resume, your reputation, or your previous accomplishments. It only cares about what you can do when someone is genuinely trying to hurt you, and for these 5 men, that reality proved devastating. Their suffering serves as a permanent reminder that professional wrestling and mixed martial arts might share some superficial similarities, but they exist in completely different universes. The cage exposes everything, forgives nothing, and humbles everyone who steps inside thinking their entertainment background has prepared them for real violence. If you found these stories as fascinating as they were tragic, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments which of these fighters you think suffered the most during their UFC careers.